We have entered the darkest part of the year, the period between Halloween and the winter solstice. And with everything else that's going on in the world, with the uncertainty that pervades our days, it seems almost natural to turn to an agency outside ourselves for succor and protection. And today, Crystal and I will talk about the various spirits we might call upon in our hour of need, and also the ways in which we still use a lot of magical techniques for protection and luck today, even without necessarily realizing that we do them. But I think first it's in order that we introduce ourselves and talk a little bit about our research, what we do, and who we are. So, Crystal, what's your PhD? What do you work on?
Oh, hello. I'm Crystal, obviously. My PhD is in historic graffiti in parish churches, and I primarily focus on Suffolk. But it's a PhD in archaeology and history. I've been doing graffiti studies for about 7 years. And so over those years, I've come across a variety of marks that are often associated with protection and rituals to keep people safe from either the elements or spiritual entities, and record them. So I became kind of more interested in magic along the way. So Anna, what do you do?
I am also a PhD student at the University of Exeter, and my project at first glance doesn't necessarily explicitly link to superstition because I study the horned god. He is one of the central deities of modern paganism and Wicca. He's associated with nature, wildness, sexuality, the male principle, and I look at how the horned god is used both in a pagan context and in fantasy. But what that has led me to realize is that this figure plays a very large role in inspiring people to be more environmentally friendly. And it creates this very interesting discussion around what is nature and what is our relationship with the natural world. So in that sense, kind of modern iterations of magical thinking is absolutely what I'm studying. And by extension, I'm very interested in ways that we use magic in our daily lives today. So that's what I do. Right. I guess we should start this with talking about what popular magic actually is, because I found that a lot of people kind of confuse magic with a religious tradition, where they'd say that Christianity is completely anti-magical and paganism or any kind of indigenous religion predating Christianity is inherently magical. So folk magic isn't a religion. It's the small acts of magical thinking, small acts of protection or luck seeking that people do regardless of what religion they follow, or even if they don't adhere to any particular religious tradition. And the combination and the coexistence of various religions, traditions expressed in folk magic is fascinating.
I think with folk magic, it's important when we're talking about magical thinking to really try and remind ourselves to be removed from this idea of, you know, the high magic traditions of spell books and grimoires and everything else, and keep in mind that magical thinking is just, it's another way of being spiritual, like spiritual but not religious, so to speak. And that's kind of what that translates to. Because when you're looking at things like the medieval and early modern period, which is what I specialize in, you get this weird kind of like concurrent, like running side by side, you know, very, very focused on, you know, God and Christ and saints and the proper church. But then at the same time, you know, loads of protective marks, all sorts of legends, all sorts of interesting stories and fear about ghosts and demons and well, by our today's standards, things like zombies almost. And you have this kind of weird back and forth where in a solely Christian mindset, by today's standard, you shouldn't be worried about those things. You shouldn't be worried about ghosts, for example, but in previous time periods, it was accepted to believe both at the same time concurrently, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's quite common.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about how many sacred wells are dedicated to certain saints, like that's in a way almost idolatrous, where you go to this particular location and worship or seek propitiation from this particular place, and yet they coexist, or they exist within the Christian ethos. And then, yeah, if we could jump to the next picture.
Oops, sorry.
No worries. This is the pine tree at Doon Hill in Scotland, rumored to be a transformed parson who believed that Doon Hill was inhabited by fairies, communicated with them for a long time, and even wrote the book about their morals and code of conduct called the Secret Commonwealth. So when he was approaching an elderly age, he prophesied that when he dies, he will be carried off to fairyland. And he did die on this hill and allegedly transformed into this pine tree. And since then, this was in the 18th century, I believe, people have been coming and leaving offerings for the fae folk and for this parson. And you can't see very clearly, and I didn't want to really take photos super close of people's prayers, but the offerings range from like people's old ties or ribbons to written prayers and little angel statuettes, which suggests that people of a Christian mindset, or at least happy to use Christian imagery, and people of a more pagan leaning both use the site and are quite happy engaging in this kind of folk magic. Another interesting combination of Christian and pagan sentiment is Joan White's grave in Minster Church in Boscastle. So Joan White was an 18th century tanner, so she worked with leather, who lived in Bodmin, and allegedly had a very feisty spirit, for which she ran into trouble with the authorities and was jailed. While in prison, she was denied food, but however, she did not succumb to starvation. And according to her, this was because she was brought sustenance by her fairy friends. Hence, she was dubbed the Fighting Fairy Woman of Bodmin. After she died, her skeleton was displayed for quite a long time in the house of the governor of Bodmin Jail, whose name I wrote down and then completely, William Hicks. William Hicks is his name, until it was purchased by the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Boscastle. And upon purchasing the skeleton, they decided to rebury it. And as tradition stands, as she was accused of being a witch, Joan White was buried outside of consecrated ground near Minster Church. And since then, her grave has become this very interesting pilgrimage site for people of alternative spirituality. So on the one hand, you have a church as a pilgrimage site and a place of worship. On the other hand, right next to it, just outside the church bounds, you've got this grave with the little offerings of cowrie shells and necklaces strewn over it.
Carrying on with that, I just want to briefly talk about pilgrimage to graves, which is something that some people still kind of do today. This is the very top of William Blake's grave in Bunhill Fields burial ground in London. And as you can see, there's quite a collection of things there. So there's, pencil, there's a bit of Lego, bits of pottery, bottle cap, bit of it looks like either lavender, rosemary, potentially a necklace. So there's all sorts of things there that people balance along the top. And then usually in the front, people do leave flowers. And this is a practice that's kind of carried through to today. In a lot of churchyards you go into, if they've got, famous residents, if that's what you want to call them, people will bring small things and leave them at the graveside. And there's not really any sort of, there doesn't seem to be rather, any sort of really religious thing about it. It's just this weird little thing that we do to either commemorate that we've been there, to honor somebody that for most of us, they've been long dead. Like when you look at the grave you showed, she's been so long dead that pretty much anybody visiting her grave today is not going to have ever met her or known her face to face, or even had parents or even grandparents that may have known her. So it's very interesting how with modern magical thinking, we do this visitation to people that we've never met but have somehow had some strange connection or impact on our lives. And you can find it literally all over, but I just thought this was a good example because of the diversity of offerings that are on this one tombstone in the middle of London, and just nobody really bothers it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and continuing on that thread, so churches, when you go into them today, medieval ones, early modern ones, what have you, if you look around, a lot of them have scratchings on the walls. And I don't recommend you do what whoever did this in this picture did, which is take a Sharpie and fill in the names and the lines and everything. Like, please don't do that. That hurts the stone, that damages the building. Don't help us. It's okay. However, it did work really well for this photograph. You'll find in bell towers, people putting the names and initials. Sometimes they'll write out the peals of bells for rehearsal. In the body of the building themselves, you will find these are all commemorative graffiti, so it's remembering somebody or certain events. You will find these all over church buildings and in all sorts of different spots. This is in the bell tower of St. Vidas Elias Foster in London. Another good example is the church in Stanfield in Suffolk, where it has commemorative stuff going all the way up the sides of the tower arch. There's, I think, a handful of these in Exeter Cathedral, if you know where to look, usually on other memorials, but that's a different lecture for a different day as to why we put memorials on memorials. But we get this kind of weird thing where people start to see like one bit of commemoration and then they add their own and then they add their own and then they keep adding and adding and adding. If you look here, this slide is mostly early to mid 18th century, but in the same tower we do have stuff going much further into the century and even a little bit into the 19th century, if I recall correctly. So you do have these weird spots where people are just kind of remembering things and putting it there, and there's not really any clues as to what was going on in 1729 for TD or 1740, is that a 6 or an 8, the PLC. There's no other clues. This is all that we have. And that's something that's really interesting to me, is because usually when you're doing something commemorative, you want it to be very like concrete. This is what happened, this is the result of it, this is who was here, and this is the date. But you come across these things, and it's almost this kind of just like passing through almost bit of commemoration and bit of remembering people or events that you get throughout time.
Yeah. Talking of bell towers, they are really fascinating spots for all sorts of activity. And one that comes to mind specifically, I don't have a photo here, is St. Clement's Church in the Isle of Harris in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, where obviously a church, a used church, but in the bell tower, there is a window facing west over the water. And on the windowsill under it is a little kind of altar offerings shelf where people bring shells or coins or little written notes, which again is not an explicitly Christian tradition, but again suggests that people are coming and using this space with some kind of magical intent.
Yeah, bell towers do have a lot going on in them, and they do play. I don't want to get the idea that, you know, all bell towers have magic graffiti in it. That's not what I'm trying to say, but they're interesting places socially. So there's one kind of bell tower, or at least the entrance to the bell tower I can think of in Suffolk at St. Mary the Virgin Lydgate, where on the outside is actually a muster call, just written out. It's about that big and it's just written there in the stone for the community to come and read. So you get this kind of weird blend of, it's a spiritual space, but it's also a social space, and there's a lot of different things going on. And I think that, you know, particularly when we think about popular magic today and magical thinking today, when it comes to visiting places like church towers or historic buildings or holy buildings or wells, you get this kind of weird connection where people see that this, you know, kind of in our minds, like this would be a sacred holy place, and they see in the past that perhaps it was a little more social, a little more secular, not as, you know, hardline Christian as we tend to think of it. and they kind of then participate in that same kind of vein to be able to kind of connect themselves to the past, but also kind of participate, well, I wouldn't say connect themselves to the past, but participate in a tradition that they're seeing and then mimicking, but also kind of changing slightly at the same time.
Yeah. Just to clarify for my own sake, what's a muster call?
When it's time to build up to go fight the Spanish Armada.
Oh, okay.
Puts out the muster to get men to go fight said Spanish Armada.
Excellent, all clear.
So I mean, it's for different wars, but that one in particular is for going off to fight the Spanish Armada.
Yeah. Another interesting example of just how interpenetrating a lot of the religious traditions are is this next example, which is a pentacle, which most of you will recognize as this core pagan symbol today. It's one of the first images that comes to mind, and yet it is on a baptismal font from the 11th century from a church in Stowe in North Yorkshire.
There are loads of pentacles on baptismal fonts all over the place. There's a really nice shiny one at Sheffield Cathedral, like beautifully carved, very recent. And they also show up as graffiti too, but I'll let you go back.
No, and unfortunately, it's not because the stonemasons were secret pagans and were trying to further their faith in this very unlikely space. It's because the pentacle is used in Christianity quite widely. It can symbolize the 5 wounds of Christ, or the if you're going into the medieval period, the 5 chivalric virtues. And one of the most kind of literary pertinent examples where it shows up is the medieval romance Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where Gawain's shield is a golden pentacle on red, I believe, to symbolize just how noble and virtuous and forthright he is, and also how devout a Christian he is. So again, over the years, certain images crop up in different religious traditions, or certain images can be divorced from any kind of religious association altogether. For instance, there's a long-standing tradition that Anglo-Saxon monumental crosses, these big stone-carved crosses you get in the land, they often have vegetative and quite pagan-looking carvings and imagery on them. And they were thought to be these conversion narratives for the general population who were still pagan, and the crosses were erected by the elite who were promoting this new brand of religion. Unfortunately, the current theory stands that the vegetative designs and the pagan-looking symbols were just an art style, really. Those were the artistic convention that, yes, did arise out of a pagan culture, but didn't have an explicit spiritual connection by the time they were used on the crosses. So they're really just pretty decorative bits.
You occasionally get stories, but they're usually stories of saints as well. If I recall correctly, Saxon's a little bit before my time period, but I do recall on some of the bases, you do get like saints narratives or particular images of a particular saint, depending on where you are.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are still stories, but a lot of them aren't as explicit as, and we had Odin, and Odin is in, and now we don't have Odin, and we have Jesus, and here's how they replace.
Not like putting an X over Odin, and then like not this, and then putting a Jesus and then circle it. That's not the case.
Friendship with Odin cancelled. Jesus is my best friend now. Anyway, yes.
Cancel culture just got rid of Odin. I don't know how to feel about that. So kind of if we look at something like a pentacle or pentangle, as we kind of talk about them in graffiti land, in churches, and we talk about stuff that you see in churches that looks quite not Christian. This is an image from St. Margaret of Antioch, Coolidge, one of my personal favorite churches to spend time in and look at graffiti in. And you'll notice there's just a lot going on here. There's a big circle with like kind of 4 petals in it. There's a smaller circle with a flower in it. There's what looks like a tree branch, and then more lines and more circles. And kind of the more you look at this image, the more jumps out at you. This is a good example of my daily life and what I study and what I research. but it's also a really good example of a collection of imagery that's associated with ritual and protective kind of purpose. So there's all sorts of arguments and debates about these compass drawn circular based designs. The prevailing thought is that they are there to be a kind of warning or stop from kind of bad wishes, bad demons, bad spirits, bad things in general. You will hear the term witch mark, which is incorrect. There's no other way for me to say that. Witch marks is just not a thing. There's no way to prove that any of these marks were there to protect specifically against witches. In fact, there's no proof that any of these marks are there to protect against any one singular thing. But because of where this is located in the building, which is right by the main door, it's where people would have been coming in, and likely where people would have been wanting to like leave things. So you don't necessarily want something to follow you in. So it's very likely that this turned into a practice for that. But because we also have so many different kinds of things going on here, and further up and down this pillar, we have even more examples of graffiti that have a kind of a ritual protective purpose associated with them. It's hard to say how new or old any of these are as well, by the way. So it's kind of looking like it's just kind of a place where you go to make these kind of marks. It's a place where you go to participate in this tradition of making a mark to protect yourself from something. We may never know what that something is, just, you know, putting that out there, but it's from something. Now you find these a lot in churches, but we've also found them in barns. This is a very famous bit of graffiti from Bradford and Avon Barn. It's been photographed loads of times by all sorts of people. It's right in the doorways you come in. And inside that building, we keep finding these circular marks all along the inside of the barn, and then in particular up inside, like kind of where the windows are. So you have like the small slit window and then the stonework going in, you'll find one on this surface or just below it or on the other surface, or sometimes both. So you get a very strong sense that this isn't something that's there to help them build the building. These geometric shapes aren't there to serve any architectural purpose. You know, why are they up in the windows? Why are they at all the entrances? Typically with graffiti, when we're finding things like this at an entrance or an exit or near windows, things like that, we tend to go, that's probably protective, because particularly with something like a tithe barn, which is where this is, that's where food is kept and stored, and you don't necessarily want anything untoward happening to that. It's kind of similar to, I would call it similar to practice of having a charm written for you, which you could later, you know, in later centuries, you could pay someone to write a charm for you to like protect your cow against giving sour milk or something like that, or protect your flock from getting ill, and you could bury it in the barn or put it in the doorway of the barn to protect things. So this is just, I think, another way that people were protecting food as well as themselves. So that's what we have going on there with graffiti. So in this one, we see it looks kind of like just a bunch of squares, and then there's some dots on the center square. Some of you may be familiar with games like Fox and Geese. We do find little bits like this, sometimes little checkerboard designs, other game board designs like Merrill's, found in churches. If you look carefully, you notice that there's a pew off to the side in this photograph. So the game board is not on a horizontal surface. It's not there to be played by different people in service because they're bored. We do find those on choir, on like where their choir sits and their benches. We find those all the time there, but that's not what this is. This is somewhere upright. What's interesting to me is the dots in the center. Clearly people were interacting with this image somehow, but there's an idea that game boards such as this do serve a bit of a protective purpose, because so many things are imbued with spiritual meaning in the medieval and early modern era, that did end up encompassing games. So it was usually with a game like this, you would want to either drive something towards the center to be trapped or drive something out of the center to get rid of it. So depending on the game that you would find in a church, that's kind of the context that we tend to associate with game boards, especially when they're smaller or on an upright surface. And again, with this one, the most interesting thing is all those little pock marks in the center square that show that somebody at some point was probably putting something there and then doing something, I don't know what, but they're doing something to kind of interact or participate with whatever this image was. was actually meaning to do functionally, because we can't tell you the exact function of how this worked with evil spirits or bad vibes or whatever you want to call it. We don't know exactly how this worked, but it is kind of what we think goes with it, which leads us to
the labyrinth, or rather a labyrinth. This is an image quite popular in Cornwall and found on rock carvings in Cornwall, although any kind of ancient provenance of it is very, very unclear. But as Crystal mentioned, there's this sense of you either want to keep something out of this very convoluted shape, or you want to draw something in. And this shape was actually, and is still today, used in meditation, where you will either mentally or finger walk the labyrinth. And when you reach the center, you are allegedly enter the other world, or you enter an alternative mental state, and that is a little aid for your meditation to help you on your journey, quite literally your journey through the labyrinth. Coming back to something you mentioned before, Crystal, about a lot of these marks, these protective marks occurring in liminal spaces, so on thresholds or in places where the inside and the outside come into contact. There are still protective workings and protective traditions that operate along the same principle today, especially to do with mirrors. If you ever see a mirror angled into the street from a window, or you come in and you see a mirrored ball in the window above a door, that's probably a protective article, a protective item set to reflect any kind of evil eye, any kind of bad wishes or bad luck back out into the street, rather than allowing it to enter the house. Again, with mirror balls, you'll hear them called witch balls, but there's no specific connection between mirror surfaces and witches. In a way, there are many more associations with mirrors and vampires, but these kind of mirrors and thresholds and liminal spaces are mostly intended to just protect the owner of the house or occupants of the house against any kind of bad wish that might come their way. Another thing, and this is very much to do with magic we've forgotten we do, things that we kind of mindlessly repeat as little traditions or quirks that have a magical origin that we might not necessarily be aware of. And it's the things with holes. I am sorry for the crassness of this comment, but who of us hasn't looked for hagstones or fairy stones on the beach, which are these rocks with natural holes through them, and they are considered good luck. They're considered beneficial for dispelling any kind of magic that you might come into contact with. And if you look through the hole, you're likely to see fairy folk or the other world or what have you. This is Menantol near Penzance in Cornwall, and it's a slightly more monumental version of a hagstone. And it's a healing stone, effectively. The hole in the rock is meant to take away illness if you go through the hole, or if you pass a child through the hole, or if you carry like a sick pet or an item that's not working out for you. And again, it comes back to this idea of boundaries. You're supposed to be able to cross a threshold through this hole and leave all of the bad stuff behind you. And it's still being used quite actively today. So if you can go to Cornwall once the lockdown is over and it's all safe, do check it out. Oh, this is one of my favorite places, where this notion that we forget the origins of things, and in our forgetting we ascribe them a magical origin, is seen very clearly. These are the Tar Steps. It's the longest clapper bridge in Britain. And this crossing has been used at least since the Bronze Age. And the bridge, in one form or another, has been there since that time, although what you see now has been reconstructed in the medieval era. So sometime in the Middle Ages, a legend arose that this bridge was built by the devil with the intent of tricking people, because anyone who would cross the bridge would die. To check this theory, the locals sent a cat across, and the cat disappeared in the middle of the bridge. So the next person the villagers sent across was the parson. And the parson bargained with the devil, saying that, well, there's really no good in the devil building the bridge, because the villagers know about this. Nobody's going to cross it. The devil won't get any souls. It's all going to be a big disaster. So the devil conceded that he will allow people to use this bridge, but advised them to stay away when he was sunbathing. So if ever you happen to be near the Tower Steps on a lovely warm summer day and you see a stranger basking in the middle of it, probably don't cross it, just walk away.
Two things. One, I love how it's like, dear Satan, this isn't economical for you. So yeah. And then Satan's like, okay, fair enough. Also, if we go by it, one of the things I love about English folklore is that if we go by it, the devil was very busy in the medieval period with construction projects all over the country. And that, I think that does tie in well with, things we've forgotten the origin of, and then we just ascribe it to something else. But I mean, it's, if you look at, the stories of Jack of Kent, who, is getting into throwing stones contests with the devil, and that's how you get some of the standing stones in certain areas. The devil was very busy then.
Yeah. So this is leaving Britain for a little bit, and you might recognize this is Fushimi Inari in Japan, one of the most famous Inari shrines. Inari is a deity of the harvest, and you might also recognize this shrine from the multiple statues of foxes or kitsune, who are Inari's guardians and messengers. And to the left is just the Torii gates that the shrine is famous for, and to the right, these are written prayers tied onto the ropes surrounding one of the shrine little shrine parts. And this feeds into the written word being considered very powerful, more powerful than speech. There are still practices of writing down wishes and then either burying the paper or burning the paper and scattering the ashes to make the wish come true. Here, the written word is thought to be to have a fast track to the deity almost. And therefore, you would be beneficial in writing down your wish and leaving it until it rots away, and then the deity is supposed to hear you. Yeah, that's what that is.
So really quickly, as we're on the subject of magic, we forgot that we do. These are taper burn marks, which show up all over the place in historic houses. These are from Exeter Cathedral on one of the screens. They do occasionally show up in churches on doorways and park close screens if you look very carefully. But as you can see, this one's got quite a few marks. It's got it on kind of the upper bit of the screen there, and then down here in the main body, there's this massive cluster of them. And taper burns usually have this colloquial story. If you go to a National Trust house or whatever, they will tell you, oh, and that's where people forgot that the candle was lit, and it just kind of burnt that design. And we know that that's very unlikely with where many of these marks are, and also with how many of them that there are. So typically what taper burns kind of designate is protection, usually from fire. The idea is it's been touched with fire, so it doesn't need to get touched with fire again. Sometimes you'll see it referenced as a sort of, or rather you'll find it in a context where it seems like it might be protecting from something like lightning, but then again, lightning did cause fires, so it's usually associated with fire protection system of some sort. The most famous set of taper burn marks, however, are related to the story of the Black Shuck, over in Suffolk. And essentially, it depends on which version of the story you get. There's a lot of different versions of the story, so nobody come after me for this. But depending on the version, either this Black Shuck, a demon, black demon dog, shows up, runs into the church, kills a man and a boy, and then on his way out, the steeple collapses and he leaves his claw marks in the doors as kind of a reminder that he was there. Other versions of Black Dog stories have people closing the doors, and then the claw marks are there proving that, you know, he couldn't get in. It depends kind of where you are, because it's Black Dog stories from all over the UK. But the ones in Suffolk in particular are very clearly taper bin marks. If you go there, they're quite large, quite deep, and they're right there on the door, and they are taper bin marks, likely done previous to this legend, obviously, to protect from fire. And somewhere along the line, someone forgot that practice, and someone forgot that that's what was done, and this legend sprung up around it involving this mythical hellhound instead. So if you do go there, it's a lovely story, but do take it with a grain of salt. So I know that a big part of what you do, Anna, is you study performative stuff when it comes to popular magic and folk magic and magical thinking today. So I briefly wanted to discuss Crossbones Graveyard in London while we were at it. Crossbones is kind of this weird little unconsecrated burial ground that's affiliated with medieval prostitutes. It's become this kind of center every month where people go and have a small little almost service. And I've gone just to, you know, just kind of see. And it's basically a service for they say, for all religions and none. So anyone can participate, whether or not you actually are pagan or are Christian or Buddhist or whatever. They don't care, you can participate. And it's just like a little bit of a remembrance to remember people who are outcast in society and outcasts among us. But part of this service involves sometimes the holding of candles, and different people from the audience will hold candles, sometimes songs. The Southwark Mysteries was a play written by John Constable, who's done a lot of work at this site to help preserve it from further development, because it is a resting site for thousands and thousands of people. He'll recite bits from his play, or other people will, and it turns into this kind of interesting folk, performance, spiritual, it doesn't really fit in one bucket sort of event. And then at the end, what people will do is tie certain things to the gates. So you can see all sorts of things, all different kinds of totems. Some people will tie prayers or obituaries of people that they loved. Some people come and make new decorations for the gates every month. They'll make like beautiful, like crocheted spider webs. At Halloween, we write names of people who we know were buried in that graveyard, and they'll tie them on the gates as well. And so you get it's this really interesting kind of blend in this space where people are allowed to interact with something that is usually considered quite spiritual, but it also falls under the category of historic conservation. So yes, that's Crossbones. And at the end, the very, very end, there's usually a circle of gin drawn on the ground. And circles, of course, always have that kind of magical context and that kind of sealing of space or holding of space. So if they do continue to have vigils the 23rd of every month, and once lockdown is over, if anyone is interested, and I'm in London on the 23rd of a month, I would suggest going, because it's a really unique experience for anyone to really participate in. And I'll let you carry on with performative stuff.
The sheer amount of offerings and tokens left on the gate in the previous photo shows just how valuable and appealing to a lot of people that kind of practice and that kind of commemoration is. And I think
it builds up over time, and I know that there have been guests there from as far as like Brazil have come just to see the gates and tie something there. So it is really pervasive.
Yeah, and I think this also is very evident in immersive theatre nowadays, because this is a photo from Divine Proportions, an immersive dinner show done by Shotgun Carousel for the Vaults in Waterloo 2 years ago. And the way the show was described is that it's a modern reimagining of the Roman Bacchaic rites, so the rites to Bacchus, the god of wine, revelry, and pleasure, and divine madness and inspiration. And here we have a version of Bacchus in the center, surrounded by Maenads, his priestesses, who throughout the evening interacted with the guests and both performed to the guests and also involved the guests in the various activities that they did. There was also a lot of food and a lot of alcohol. There was an open bar. So it really was the best of both worlds. And to a lot of people there, from what I could see, this space really became more than just a performance. They did more than consume kind of a piece of culture or an experience. They did actually try to embody this kind of persona of the archaic revelers, and in the way they were kind of engaging with a spiritual aspect of this as well, despite this being a commercial theatre performance. That um, this is one of my favorite spaces in London, is the London Mithraeum in the Bloomberg space in the city. And you can see there's not much of it left. So Mithraeum, temple to the loosely Roman god Mithras, although he was worshipped very widely in the classical world and beyond it. He's a sun god, and the Mithraic cult is known for its mysteries. So there were levels of initiation that you went through as you engaged with various cult activities and attained different stages on your spiritual journey, and those were secret. And the higher up you progress, the more kind of exclusive rites and secrets and mysteries you get access to. And what they have done at this archaeological site is they have recreated what the temple may have sounded like when it was in use. So you get to be a worshipper of Mithras mid ceremony. The soundtrack is not in English, which creates this very magical atmosphere of you're not quite sure what's going on. They've done an amazing thing with kind of 3D sound, surround sound and lighting to completely transform this quite bare, barren space into a very spiritual, very living environment. And again, the popularity of this site and the fact that it was set up and conceived of in this way to begin with suggests that there is a lot of interest in people today towards engaging in magical thinking, in ritual that might not necessarily adhere to their own religious tradition or any kind of specific religious tradition at all. It's experiencing that wonder, that mystery that I think people really crave today.
I think part of it with the Mithraeum as well, because it's also one of my favorite spots in London, which is right across from my other favorite spot in London, which is St. Stephen Walbrook, which the original church used to actually sit over where this temple was, like way back. It does give you that sense of other, and one of the things that I really like that they've done with the space is as you go down, it shows you all the layers of London's history. So you do this, it's this interesting, like, you're getting like all the historical information, but the closer and closer you get to the bottom, you see how much has gone on between when this would have been a functional temple space versus now. And it does this really good job of transporting you back. And then you go into the room and I think they basically run it, I want to say like every 15 minutes. Yeah. And you have this kind of like experience of the other, an experience of something that we've really forgotten as a culture in a lot of ways. And you get to just feel almost completely lost. And then at the end, it all lights up and it's like, whoa. And now I'll look at this archaeological artifact. It does this really good job of blending historical conservation, archaeology, and then this performance of otherness that I haven't really experienced anywhere else, to be quite frank.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think that concludes our presentation-y / talky bit. Come join us back on the Zoom chat. Hopefully you have something of your own that is from kind of the realm of folk popular magic, but you can chat with Anne and I there for a little bit, ask some questions. And yeah, we'll be there for about 20 to 30 minutes. So we'll see you all over there, yeah?